The whole thing turned on a hollow wooden bung from an oak cider barrel, the kind of thing you toss in the scrap bin without a second thought. Inside that bung was the original partnership contract that proved my sister-in-law forged my signature, sold my 45% of our heritage cider orchard to a national brand for $680,000, and handed me a check for $3,800 with the word pomace typed in the memo line. By the time the dust settled, that bung voided the sale, put her and her husband in a federal fraud docket, and left her scrubbing my press hopper in a smock that says pressed out trust. This is the story of how I dismantled her with patience, a bent hairpin, and 30 years of reading people's hands while they held a cafeteria tray. I want to tell you exactly how the mechanics worked, because the devil lives in the details, and so did my husband's last gift. I am not the kind of woman you notice. I spent 30 years in a hospital cafeteria, serving oatmeal and Salisbury steak, and I saved $119,000 in deposits that never exceeded $40 at a time. I kept a green deposit slip folded in my wallet, and every Friday I walked to the branch on my lunch break and handed over cash while wearing a hairnet and a plastic apron. Every one of those deposits was a deliberate act of hope. I had 2 daughters, and I wanted them to have a piece of land that smelled like apples when they said their vows. My late husband Marcus was the quiet architect of our family, and he believed that orchard would hold our grandchildren someday. Then he died on a Tuesday in October, and before the funeral flowers wilted, Diane and her husband Richard were in my kitchen with a stack of papers and a smile that did not reach their eyes. The death hit me like a dull blade. Marcus had gone out to the south pasture to move a tractor hitch, and the hitch failed, and he was gone before the ambulance reached the gravel road. I did not get to say goodbye. I got to stand in the mud and watch the EMTs fold a sheet over his face while the orchard he loved dripped rain onto the back of my neck. The next morning, Diane arrived in a black Escalade with Richard, a man whose watch cost more than my first car, and they did not come to mourn. They came to manage. Diane walked through the farmhouse with a clipboard and started making lists of equipment, inventory, and recipes. She had a new black dress that still had the crease from the store bag, and she held the clipboard like a clipboard was a weapon. She picked up Marcus's handwritten recipe book from the kitchen counter, the one where he had logged every fermentation temperature and every press yield for 11 years, and she tucked it under her arm like it already belonged to her. Richard stood in the driveway on his phone, talking about valuations and probate and escrow, and every time he looked at me he gave me a small tight smile that never reached his eyes either. I was told to sit down, drink tea, and let them handle everything. I did sit down, but I did not let them handle anything, not for 1 second. The day after Marcus's funeral, I went into his workshop to find a single object he had always kept on the shelf above the cider press. The workshop smelled like oak and apple pomace, and the faint dust of a man who had spent his weekends building the press we used every fall. It was an old oak bung from a cider barrel, dark with age and rough at the edges. The bung was the stopper that fit into the bunghole of a barrel, the hole where you test the cider and top off the barrel as the fermentation settles. Marcus used to roll it in his palm when he was thinking, and I picked it up because it was the kind of thing he would have wanted me to hold. Diane walked in, saw it in my hand, said that is trash, and tossed it into the plastic bin by the door without breaking stride. I waited until she left, then fished it out and slipped it into my coat pocket. The oak was still warm from his shelf. That night, alone in the spare bedroom of the house where I had raised my children, I held the bung under a lamp. It was heavier than it should have been. I tapped it on the table and heard a faint rattle, the kind of sound that makes your pulse move into your ears. The top unscrewed along a seam so fine I almost missed it, a seam Marcus had cut and sanded and fitted so perfectly it looked like a single piece of turned oak. Inside the hollow core was a rolled sheaf of papers, and on top of the papers was a note in Marcus's handwriting. It said, "Do not trust Diane and Richard. Save yourself." The papers were the original partnership agreement, notarized, with my 45% stake and the lifetime cider clause for my daughter's weddings written in plain language. The note was the last page of a small pocket ledger, and at the bottom Marcus had written, "They will come for the orchard. Hide this where only you will look." I sat there with the hollow bung in my lap and the note shaking in my hand, and I understood that my husband had seen the vultures before they even landed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family can steal more from you than a stranger ever could. Now back to what happened when they tried to make me sign. 2 days later, Diane sat me at her kitchen table, which was actually my kitchen table, because they had already moved me into their house across town and installed themselves in the farmhouse. She had a stack of papers and a soft voice. She wore a grey cardigan that made her look like a nurse, and she kept her hands folded on the table like we were at a church social. She said I was too grief-stricken to run the orchard, that Richard had an MBA, that I deserved rest after all those years in the cafeteria. The papers included a durable power of attorney, a quitclaim deed on the farmhouse, and a document titled Consent to Dissolve Partnership. She slid a pen across the table and said, "Cora, we just want to take care of you." I let my hand shake. I asked her to repeat herself twice. I said I forgot where I put my reading glasses. I said I needed to think about Marcus and the girls and the apples. I did not sign. Over the next week the pressure was constant, a slow drip of concern that was really coercion. Every meal came with a new form. Every evening Richard would say, "We only want to protect you, but the orchard is losing money every day and we need to act fast." He produced a preliminary valuation spreadsheet that showed the orchard losing $4,000 a month, a number he had typed himself with no accounting software, no receipts, just a column of red figures from his own laptop. He said the only way to stop the bleeding was to let him assume control. I said I did not understand finance. He said that was exactly the problem. They packed my clothes and moved me into their spare room, the one with a bed facing the wall and a deadbolt on the outside of the door. Diane called it a safety feature, because she said I was fragile and might wander at night. I called it what it was. She locked me in every night at 10, and I would lie there in the dark listening to her talk on the phone about tile samples and countertops while I pressed my palm against the hollow bung hidden under the mattress. One night I got up and tested the door. The deadbolt held and there was no interior thumb turn. I made myself breathe slow and sat back on the bed. I told myself I had survived decades of cafeteria steam tables and late shift supervisors. A locked door was just another broken fryer. You fix it or you wait for the right moment to walk through. The first red flag was the phone calls. Richard would take his cell phone into the office and close the door, but the house was old and the vents carried sound. I heard him say things like the escrow account is frozen, the title company needs the original, and if we don't get her signature by Friday the whole deal collapses. He paced the hallway outside my room at 2 in the morning, panicked, muttering about a bridge loan and a balloon payment. Diane started ordering furniture and a new SUV. She talked about a kitchen renovation while I ate toast, and she used words like granite and farmhouse sink, as if those words could cover up the fact that none of the money was hers. She scheduled a delivery for a 6-burner Viking range while the orchard sale was still not closed, and Richard signed the receipt with a pen that left a hard, heavy mark, the kind of mark a man makes when he is spending money he does not have yet. They were spending money they did not have yet, and they were doing it with my name on the dotted line somewhere. On a Thursday morning the garbage disposal ceased. Richard stood over the sink with a butter knife, jabbing at the rubber splash guard like he was going to scare the motor into working. Diane called a plumber and said it would be $200 just for the visit. I walked over, and I did what any woman who spent 30 years fixing cafeteria equipment on the fly knows how to do. I hit the reset button on the bottom of the unit. When that did not kick it on, I unplugged the disposal, reached under the sink, and used a 1/4-inch Allen wrench in the hex socket at the base to spin the flywheel by hand. The disposal coughed up a wad of paper and half a bank statement, along with a spoon and a tangle of kale stems. I recognized the bank's logo because I had spent 30 years reading the fine print on cafeteria vendor invoices, and I knew the difference between a routing number and an account number without squinting. Richard went pale and told me to leave it. I said I was just fixing the sink. While they argued about the plumber, I palmed the paper and took it to my room. It was a cashier's check receipt for $200,000, made out to a hard money lender, with a loan number and a due date that was 3 weeks away. I cleaned the coffee grounds off it with a dry toothbrush and folded it into the lining of my coat. After that I started paying attention to everything. I listened through the heating vents, I timed their comings and goings, and I memorized the sound of the office door clicking shut. Diane left for Pilates at 10, Richard left for the gym at 11. The office door had a cheap keyed lock, and the filing cabinet inside had an even cheaper one. I had learned to pick a filing cabinet lock years ago when a hospital cafeteria manager locked our time cards in a metal credenza, and I needed my overtime records to fight a payroll mistake. I took a bobby pin from my hair and a paperclip from the junk drawer, and I bent the paperclip into a tension wrench. I inserted the tension wrench into the keyway, applied a light clockwise pressure, and raked the pins with the bobby pin until I felt the 4th pin set. The plug turned with a click that sounded like a door closing on their whole scheme. The filing cabinet was full of manila folders labeled with colored tabs. I started with the one marked dissolution. Inside was the forged dissolution agreement, the one Diane had tried to get me to sign, but now it had my signature on it. I held the page under the desk lamp. The signature looked perfect at a glance, but I had spent decades watching people sign cafeteria charge slips and medical cafeteria vouchers, and I knew my own hand. My signature has a loop on the Y that always drags left, and on the forged page the loop was closed, too neat, like someone had traced it from a scanned document. There was also a notary page with a stamp that did not match the county seal. The notary's name was Diane's Pilates instructor, and I had seen that name on a class schedule stuck to the refrigerator door with a magnet shaped like a wine glass. I kept going. I found a sale agreement with a national craft beverage brand called Meridian Cider Group for $680,000, with a line item that paid off the hard money loan at closing. I found a promissory note for $175,000, and my name was typed as co-signer, with a forged signature next to it. I found a document titled Assignment of Partnership Interest that transferred my 45% to Diane for the sum of $3,800, with the notation pomace disposal. Pomace is the leftover pulp and skins after the apples are pressed, the waste product, the thing you throw out or feed to pigs. They had literally priced my life's work as garbage. I stood there in the dim office with the papers in my hands, and I felt the cold fury of a woman who had served too many trays to let someone call her inheritance pomace. I photographed every page with my phone, using the macro setting to catch the pen pressure and the notary stamp. I took close-ups of the paper grain where the tracing had left indentations. Then I put everything back exactly the way I found it and locked the cabinet. The next morning I fished a half-shredded document out of the office trash can, the kind with cross-cut particles. I spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with a roll of clear tape and a pair of tweezers, reconstructing a credit card application. The name on the application was mine. The social security number was mine. The only thing wrong was the signature, which looked like it had been written by someone holding the pen in their fist while reading over their own shoulder, the way Richard signed his name on receipts at the gas station. The final piece was a debt consolidation plan, and it listed me as the responsible party for a credit card balance of $32,000 that had been taken out in my name 2 weeks after Marcus died. I checked my credit report that night on a burner phone I had bought at a gas station with cash. The card was real. They had been using my social security number to float their lifestyle, and the orchard was the collateral they planned to sacrifice to cover the mess. I was not just a target for the orchard. I was the legal scapegoat for their entire debt spiral, and they had built a paper trail that ended with my name on a foreclosure notice, and my daughters standing outside the farmhouse with nothing but the smell of apples. The next morning I called the county recorder's office from the burner phone and asked about the title to the orchard. A clerk named Mrs. Arkaffer put me on hold for 6 minutes. When she came back, she said something odd. There is a cloud on the title, she said. A UCC-1 financing statement filed by Marcus 2 years ago listing the original partnership agreement as collateral. No sale can close without the original document and the physical presence of the named partner. I asked who the named partner was. She said, "You, ma'am, only you. A UCC-1 is a lien on personal property used as collateral, and Marcus had filed one on our own partnership, tied to my identity, so that no one could ever sell or dissolve the orchard without me standing there with the original contract in my hand." The filing was a perfected security interest under Article 9 of the Uniform Commercial Code, and it meant that any title company would refuse to close without me physically present and willing. That was Marcus's dead man's switch. Diane and Richard did not know. They had been trying to force my signature because the title company could not record the sale without it. The original contract was the key, and I had it hidden in the bung under my bed. I did not tell Mrs. Arkaffer where it was. I only thanked her and hung up, and then I sat on the edge of the spare bed and pressed my palm flat against the hollow bung until the shaking stopped. I called Angela Ruiz, a compliance officer at the credit union where Marcus and I had kept our checking account for 20 years. She had flagged the $3,800 check because the signature on the back did not match my file. She said the check had been deposited into an account I did not recognize, an account that had been opened the week after Marcus died, with a mailing address that was a UPS store in another county. Angela asked me to come in with the original contract and the photographs. She said the credit union would freeze the account and file a suspicious activity report with FinCEN. She also said she would contact the FBI's white-collar unit because the amount crossed the federal threshold for wire fraud, and because the pattern of structured account openings and forged endorsements looked like the work of people who had done this before. I met her at a diner off the interstate. She wore a navy blazer and carried a folder with a thick stack of printouts. She ordered black coffee and a slice of apple pie, which I took as a good sign. She confirmed what I suspected. Diane and Richard had racked up $400,000 in debt using my name and the orchard as collateral. Angela spread the papers across the booth table, and I saw my own social security number on 3 different credit card accounts, 2 personal loans, and a business line of credit. She said, "Cora, you are not the victim of a family squabble. You are the victim of a deliberate racketeering scheme." She used words like wire fraud and bank fraud and conspiracy, and she told me the credit union's Bank Secrecy Act compliance program had already generated a cache of transaction records that showed the money moving from a hard money lender through a series of shell accounts and into Diane and Richard's personal checking. Angela asked me to lay the original contract on the table. I did under the menu, and she used a jeweler's loupe to examine the notary stamp. She said the paper was authentic, the ink was 10 years old, and the raised seal matched the county database. Then she compared it to the forged dissolution from my photographs and told me the notary stamp on the forged document came from an online vendor with a serial number that did not exist in the state system. Angela recruited me to help gather final proof. She needed the original contract and a clear chain of custody. I told her about the bung. She told me to keep it safe and wait for the right moment, and she said the FBI would want the original document produced at the table, not beforehand, because that would turn a forgery case into a caught-in-the-act case. She introduced me to Special Agent Hannah Cho, who specialized in wire fraud and racketeering. Agent Cho wore a pantsuit and a thin silver watch, and she spoke quietly. She said the U.S. attorney would take the case if we could produce the original at the exact moment they tried to force a signature, because that would prove intent and identity in the same room. I waited for the moment. It came on a Saturday morning. But first I planted a small test. The week before, I told Diane I had been feeling sharp pains in my left arm. She said you should take an aspirin and did not look up from her phone. I asked if she would take me to urgent care. She said, "We have a title meeting on Thursday, we can't miss it." That was all I needed. I chose a moment when Diane was pacing the upstairs hallway with a phone pressed to her ear and a set of fabric samples spread out on the floor like a dead peacock. I counted to 3, let my knees fold, and pitched sideways into the wall with enough force to knock a picture frame loose. I heard the glass hit the baseboard as I went down. My hip hit the floor first, then my shoulder, and I let out a harsh choking sound, one hand flailing against the baseboard, the other clutching at my sternum. I let my head loll back and my eyes flutter. The folder in my hand skittered across the hardwood and came to rest by her shoe. It was a blank folder, but she did not know that. Diane said, "Hold on, Phil," into the phone. Then she stepped over my leg, not around it, over it. I felt the hem of her dress brush my knee. She bent down, not toward my face, toward the folder. She grabbed it and shook it once. She looked at me on the floor and said, "Get up, Cora. We both know you are not dying. You've got too much fight in you, and that's always been your problem." Then she stepped over my other leg and walked into the bedroom, and I heard her tell whoever was on the phone, "No, it was nothing. She faints when she doesn't eat." Richard came around the corner, looked at me on the floor and said, "Did she sign the replacement affidavit?" When Diane said no, he made a sound like air escaping a tire and walked the other way. Neither one of them offered me a hand, a glass of water, a call to 911. Nothing. I lay there for 5 full minutes after the door closed, listening to the house settle. The wallpaper in that hallway had little blue cornflowers, and I counted 34 of them before I stood up. My hip ached for days, and every time it ached I felt glad, because it reminded me that cruelty was the only language they understood. At that moment any residual family loyalty I had left went cold. I had my answer. She would have watched me die on that hallway floor if it meant she got the orchard. I stood up, brushed the dust from my knees and went to my room. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply opened the bung, read the note again and whispered to Marcus, "I see them now." Then I called Angela and told her I was ready. The next Tuesday, Richard came into my room wearing a suit and said we were going to the bank. He said the sale was about to fall through because of a paperwork issue, and I needed to sign a replacement lost contract affidavit. He said if I did not sign, the orchard would go into foreclosure and I would lose everything, and my daughters would never get their wedding cider. He drove me to the credit union with Diane in the back seat. Diane kept looking at her phone, her thumbs flying over the keyboard, and every few seconds she would glance at me like I was a suitcase she was about to leave at the curb. Richard tapped his fingers on the steering wheel and adjusted his tie 3 times. Nobody spoke. The air in the car was tight and sour like a cider batch left to ferment too long. At one red light, Richard turned to me and said, "Cora, you sign one piece of paper and this all goes away. Think about your daughters." I looked at him and said, "I am thinking about my daughters." They marched me through the glass doors and into a private conference room. The credit union was a low brick building with a drive-through and a flag that snapped in the wind outside. A notary was waiting, a thin woman with a stamp pad and a bored expression. Angela Ruiz was at the front desk, and she gave me a small nod. The room had a long table, 4 chairs, and a pitcher of water nobody offered me. Diane put a pen in my hand. It was a heavy silver Mont Blanc, and it felt like holding a dead man's finger. She pointed to a line on a document titled Unanimous Consent to Dissolve Partnership and Release of Claim. The line had a yellow sticker arrow next to my name, typed in bold. Richard said, "Sign it, Cora, before you lose everything." I looked at the pen, then at Diane, then at Richard, then at the notary who would not meet my eyes. I put the pen down on the table. I said, "I am not signing." Diane's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle under her ear jump. She leaned over and whispered, "You are going to sign because if you don't, you will spend the rest of your life in a Medicaid bed while we sell every apple tree to a developer." I said no. "I am the original and you are the forgery." Those words hung in the air for exactly 1 second before Angela stepped into the room with 2 FBI agents and a forensic document examiner in a grey suit. The examiner carried a leather portfolio and a digital caliper. Angela pointed at me and said, "This is the moment we discussed." One of the agents, a tall man with a shaved head, said, "Diane and Richard Marsh, you are under arrest." He read them their rights, the words stacking on top of each other like bricks. Diane tried to stand and knocked the water pitcher over, and the water ran across the table and soaked the forged consent and the pen. Nobody moved to stop it. Richard's face went the color of apple butter that had been left on the stove too long. The notary stood so fast her chair fell backward and cracked against the tile floor, and the forensic examiner did not flinch. Then Angela walked over and took the bung from my handbag. She unscrewed the top in front of everyone, and the fine threads made a tiny dry sound. She slid out the rolled original partnership agreement and laid it on the table, and the forensic examiner used a pair of cotton gloves to open it. The original had Marcus's signature in blue ink, my signature in blue ink, and a notary stamp with a raised seal. The forged document had a flat stamp and traced signatures. The examiner put them side by side on a light board he had brought, and the tracing lines showed through like a map of their guilt. He pointed to the closed loop on the Y in my signature and the missing drag line, and he showed the indentations on the paper where the tracing had pressed too hard. Richard's face drained to the color of apple pulp. Diane started to speak, but one of the agents held up a hand and finished the Miranda warning. The other agent took Richard by the arm. They cuffed Diane first. She started to say something about lawyers, but the agent said she could call one from the field office. As they walked her out, she looked over her shoulder at me, and for 1 second her face lost its polish. I saw the animal panic of a woman who had never once thought the cage would close on her. The agents arrested both of them on the spot for forgery, wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The countermeasure Marcus had built fired exactly as he intended. The original contract in the bung was produced, the sale was voided, and the forged documents became the evidence that sank them. I did not need to sit. I needed to stand there and watch the 2 people who had tried to bury me get walked out in handcuffs. Diane and Richard were charged with 8 counts of felony forgery, wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. The preliminary hearing lasted 4 hours. The prosecutor entered the original contract, the forged documents, the UCC-1 filing, and the reconstructed credit application as Exhibits 1 through 47. Diane's public defender tried to argue that family disputes should not be criminalized, but the judge cut him off and called it a sophisticated financial fraud. The court seized their house, their new SUV, and the furniture she had bought with my credit, including the Viking range that was still in the box in the garage. Diane pleaded out and is serving 6 years in a state prison, where she will have plenty of time to think about pomace. Richard got 9 years for the federal charges. The $3,800 check was cancelled, and the full $680,000 sale was voided. I got the orchard back free and clear, with the original partnership intact. The credit union removed all the fraudulent accounts from my credit report, and my credit score went from a forged mess back to 811 in 6 months. The court ordered restitution from the seized assets, which paid off the hard money loan, and returned a small sum to me that I used to buy a new bottling line and a used forklift. I renamed it Core of Deceit Cidery. That fall, my older daughter got married under the north row of winesap trees. The younger one got married the next spring under the golden russet row. The cider flowed from a green glass jug Marcus had saved, and I poured the first glass for myself and one for the empty chair next to me. The first bottles had a deliberate flaw in the label run, but not the kind you fix. Under the words product of a forged family, I printed the federal docket number in 6-point type. I wanted every bottle to carry a receipt for what they tried to do. I hired a new press operator, a retired diesel mechanic named Art, who could strip a press down to its bearings and build it back before lunch. But I also hired Diane when she gets out. The judge approved a work release program, and she reports to the cidery every morning at 6. She scrubs the press hopper with a wire brush and food-safe solvent, and she wears a grey smock with the words Pressed Out Trust stenciled on the back. The first day, she looked at the smock and said I couldn't make her wear that. I told her she was right. She could choose not to work, and then she could go back to the cell and explain to the parole board that she found manual labor beneath her. She put the smock on. She scrubs the hopper until the stainless steel shines, and every bottle that leaves that press has her fingerprints on it, but not her signature. Marcus was the quiet architect. He saw the vultures before I did, and he built a dead man's switch out of a hollow oak bung and a piece of paper. He knew I would find it because he knew I was the only one who ever cleaned the workshop. He knew I would not sign because he knew I could read people's hands while they held a tray. The moral is simple. Family can fake a lot of things, but they cannot fake your hand if you know your own loops. Integrity is not a wedding toast word. It is a filing at the county recorder's office, and it is the difference between pomace and a lifetime of cider. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you believe family should never forge your name, hit like and subscribe, and maybe that like button is your own hollow bung, a small thing that can hold something huge. I'll see you in the next one.